What if everything you were taught about Africa's poverty was a lie? What if the images of famine, chaos, and conflict weren't the result of some inherent flaw in its people or systems, but the outcome of a carefully constructed illusion? What if behind every crumbling school, every overburdened hospital, and every empty pocket, there existed a blueprint not of failure, but of sabotage? A system designed not just to exploit, but to suppress, generation after generation. This isn't conspiracy. This is colonial fact. For decades, the story of Africa has been written by outsiders. Imperial powers that carved up the continent, stole its resources, erased its cultures, and then blamed the people for the ruin they left behind. And in the quiet hours before the world wakes, when truth has the courage to speak freely, one voice has dared to pierce that darkness with clarity and fire. Captain Ibrahim Traoré. More than a soldier, more than a leader, he is a storm crashing against the walls of an unjust world order. Where others see poverty, he sees plunder. Where others preach reform, he demands revolution. His words cut through decades of deception, calling not just for political change, but for a total reimagining of what Africa could be, what it was always meant to be: sovereign, united, powerful. Traoré's vision doesn't gently ask for permission. It declares an end to silence. It speaks of breaking chains forged in Berlin boardrooms and colonial mansions, of reclaiming wealth buried beneath African soil and stolen by foreign corporations, of reviving languages silenced by empire, and reigniting pride extinguished by propaganda. This isn't just another speech, another uprising, another round of promises. It's something different. It's raw, it's honest, it's dangerous to those who profit from Africa's pain. And most of all, it's a blueprint, a roadmap to rebirth. So don't scroll past, don't look away. What you're about to hear isn't just history. It's the battle cry of a continent. It's the story the world doesn't want told. And it might just be the spark that lights the fire of freedom. In the hushed dawn of Africa's unending struggle, one voice rises above the silence. Clear, unflinching, and thunderous. Captain Ibrahim Traoré. His words are not mere rhetoric. They are the echo of centuries of pain, resistance, and awakening. Africa's wounds are not the result of internal failure, but of centuries-old incisions carved by foreign hands. The 1884-85 Berlin Conference was not a diplomatic gathering. It was a boardroom of imperial greed, where European powers sat around tables and treated a continent as a pie to be sliced. With not a single African present, they drew arbitrary borders with rulers and ink, dividing ancient kingdoms, fracturing tribes, and manufacturing tension that still fuels conflict today. That infamous conference didn't just shape Africa's future, it mutilated it, granting a thin layer of legality to what historians now rightly expose as blatant profiteering, conquest, and plunder under the veil of civilization. The evidence of this brutal legacy is not abstract. It is vividly human. Take Zulu King Cetshwayo in 1879, once a towering figure of resistance, now frozen in time through a haunting image, seated, surrounded by British soldiers, dethroned and disarmed. This image is not just about one man. It is a symbol of a continent betrayed. Across Africa, similar stories unfolded. Proud kingdoms fell one by one under the barrel of foreign guns. Communities that had thrived for generations were rendered voiceless, and cultures that had withstood time were forced to kneel before flags they had never seen and laws they never wrote. This was not accidental. It was a deliberate dismantling of sovereignty. Africa was not seen as a partner in global development, but as a resource well to be drained, a human labor pool to be exploited, and a blank canvas for imperial fantasy. And from this quiet violence, a cycle of dependency and underdevelopment was born, one that still binds millions in poverty today. Once the colonial flags were planted, the true conquest began, not just of land, but of life itself. Colonial powers wasted no time in extracting everything of value from African soil and society. The British and French alike imposed a new and cruel logic. If you wanted to exist under the empire, you had to pay for your own subjugation. Across the continent, colonial administrations introduced taxes, hut taxes, head taxes, poll taxes, demanded not in barter or harvest, but in coin. But how could rural farmers who had long sustained themselves through traditional economies acquire European currency? The answer was grim. They were forced into the colonial cash economy, herded into mines, ports, and plantations as cheap labor. Men left their villages in droves to dig gold, harvest rubber, or haul cargo, not for their own enrichment, but to satisfy taxes that funded the very governments that oppressed them. In French West Africa, repression was even more institutionalized. Under the notorious Indigenat Code, colonial administrators wielded unchecked power. They could detain, punish, or exile Africans without trial. Forced labor was not an emergency measure, it was policy. For weeks, sometimes months, every year, African men were conscripted en masse to build roads, clear forests, or labor on European projects. No protest was tolerated. No negotiation allowed. The code effectively reduced millions of Africans to second-class citizens in their own land, subject to the whims of foreign bureaucrats who saw them not as humans, but as instruments of empire. Even the traditional leadership structures, once central to African governance and identity, were systematically dismantled. Sultans, elders, and tribal councils, rooted in centuries of cultural legitimacy, were brushed aside. In their place, the colonizers installed hand-picked chiefs, individuals who owed their authority not to the people, but to colonial officers. Those new chiefs had one job: extract resources and compliance. They were ordered to collect taxes, conscript soldiers, and crush resistance on behalf of their European masters. Villages that had once been governed by consensus and custom were now ruled through fear and coercion. Any attempt at resistance was met with devastating force. Whole kingdoms were shattered. Their elite either killed or absorbed into the colonial machine. Entire populations were displaced, herded into new artificial territories that bore no resemblance to their ancestral lands. The result was a continent politically decapitated and socially disoriented. What had once been a mosaic of self-determined nations became a patchwork of colonial holdings, each designed not to foster unity or growth, but to maximize extraction and obedience. All of this machinery, the railways, the ports, the roads, was not built to connect African nations or foster local prosperity. It was built with a single, ruthless objective: to siphon Africa's riches out and send them to European factories, vaults, and capitals. Infrastructure in the colonies wasn't a gift. It was a pipeline of plunder. The rail lines ran from the mines to the ports, not between African towns. Roads carved through jungles not for trade, but to transport ivory, rubber, gold, and timber under armed escort. Steamships docked not to bring goods to the continent, but to strip it bare, load after load of Africa's wealth sailing westward while the people who mined, harvested, and hauled it lived in poverty. On sprawling plantations, African men, women, and even children toiled under horrific conditions, harvesting palm oil, cotton, cocoa, and coffee, commodities that fueled Europe's industrial revolution. Yet they never tasted the profits. Processing plants were built not in Ghana or Senegal, but in Liverpool and Marseille. African rubber helped drive the tire empires of Europe. African cocoa sweetened European desserts. But the Africans who produced it were forced laborers, watched over by overseers wielding guns and quotas. Colonial armies were trained not to protect people, but to enforce production, punishing anyone who dared fall short. In places like the Congo, failure to meet rubber quotas led to mutilation or death. By the time the Cold War began, the pattern was locked in. Africa was rich in resources, but poor in power. Over 90% of African exports were still raw, unprocessed goods. Entire regions had no factories, no infrastructure of their own, only extraction routes designed by and for outsiders. European nations, drunk on Africa's stolen wealth, invested heavily in their own advancement while leaving African schools, hospitals, and industries in a state of neglect. As the Pan-African scholar Walter Rodney observed, the wealth that was created by African labor and from African resources was grabbed by the capitalist countries of Europe. The colonial state did not nurture African development. It deliberately stunted it. Education, where it existed, was not meant to empower. It was designed to produce clerks, not creators. Africans were taught how to serve, not how to innovate. Empire needed obedience, not brilliance. And so, the brightest minds were boxed in by a system that rewarded imitation over imagination. Perhaps the deepest scar, however, was not physical or economic. It was psychological. The colonizers came with a cross in one hand and a ledger in the other, preaching the gospel of the civilizing mission. African religions, traditions, and philosophies were branded as primitive or evil. Indigenous ceremonies were outlawed, languages silenced, and local knowledge dismissed as superstition. French, English, and Portuguese were declared the tongues of progress, while African voices were marginalized or erased. Missionaries built schools, but their curriculum glorified European kings and conquerors, not African heroes and thinkers. They trained a small elite, loyal not to their communities but to the colonial ideology. These men and women became intermediaries, African in blood, but European in thought. And the result? A continent with fractured identity. To this day, many African leaders and professionals speak French or English more fluently than their ancestral languages. In boardrooms and parliaments, colonial languages dominate while local dialects fade. Generations have grown up believing that greatness comes from abroad, that to be intelligent is to think like Europe, that to be modern is to abandon one's roots. This internalized doubt, the belief that African ways are inferior, is one of colonialism's cruelest legacies. It is a wound that bleeds still. Because when a people are taught to distrust their own identity, they become easier to control, easier to exploit, and harder to unify. And so, even after the flags of empire were lowered, the empire of the mind remained. Every bold policy that Captain Ibrahim Traoré champions is not born out of rebellion for its own sake. It is a direct response to the centuries of exploitation, theft, and humiliation that have scarred the African continent. His mission is not just political, It is deeply personal, deeply historical. He is not simply rejecting the presence of former colonial powers, he is confronting the architecture they left behind. Each decree, each reform is a hammer blow against the systems designed to keep Africa dependent and divided. When Traore calls on his people to break with imperialist forces, he isn't speaking metaphorically. He's pointing to the ongoing control exerted through foreign corporations, rigged trade agreements, and neo-colonial interference cloaked in aid and diplomacy. Consider his symbolic but powerful move to ban colonial-style wigs in Burkina Faso's courtrooms. Those powdered relics of European rule that once perched atop African judges as reminders of who had written the laws and for whom. By removing them, Traore is doing more than changing a dress code. He is stripping away layers of psychological domination. Or take his insistence that Burkina Faso's gold, long siphoned off by multinational firms and foreign banks, must finally serve the interests of its own people. He's not just making a nationalist plea, he's reclaiming what was stolen, what still rightfully belongs to the nation. At the heart of his mission is a call for economic sovereignty. This means more than breaking dependency. It means building self-sufficiency from the ground up. It means negotiating fair trade deals that don't bleed Africa dry. It means creating transparent contracts that benefit African workers and businesses, not just foreign shareholders. It means investing in African factories, farms, and technologies so that value is added within Africa, not exported away in raw form. But Traore knows that true freedom is not only measured in gold or contracts, it is written in the stories a people tell themselves. That's why his vision stretches beyond economics into the soul of African identity. He advocates for the revival of indigenous languages, customs, and historical narratives that were silenced under colonialism. He knows that a continent cannot rise if its people believe they are lesser. And so, like the great Pan-Africanists before him, Kwame Nkrumah, Patrice Lumumba, Thomas Sankara, Traore is reawakening Africa's pride, one truth at a time. His leadership is not just defiance, it is healing, and it carries with it a challenge to every African nation to look backward not in bitterness, but in understanding. To confront the ghosts of Berlin, of Leopold's Congo, of the French indigenate and British indirect rule. Because only by reckoning with the past can Africa chart a path forward that is truly its own. Traore's message is simple but revolutionary. Africa must be the author of its own destiny. Now is the time, not tomorrow, not someday, to listen, to act, and to stand firm. We cannot claim to love justice or peace while ignoring how Africa's underdevelopment was not an accident, but a strategy, a system meticulously engineered through colonial taxes, forced labor, military conquest, and a global economy built to extract and exploit. We must unearth and confront that history. The Berlin Conference, where men drew borders without knowing the names of the people they were dividing. The rubber terror in King Leopold's Congo, where millions died for European profit. The slave gangs who laid colonial railways with blood and broken bodies. These were not isolated atrocities. They were the foundations of an international system that still exists today in different clothing. To understand why leaders like Captain Ibrahim Traoré speak of liberation with fire in their voices, we must understand that the chains are not yet fully broken. And if we truly believe in justice, we cannot be neutral. We must take up the work of truth-telling, education, and advocacy. This means rewriting curriculums to teach the full history of empire. It means supporting grassroots programs that restore African languages and stories to classrooms. It means standing behind African led businesses, building investment platforms that keep profits on the continent, and organizing global campaigns for reparations, debt cancellation, and fair trade. But beyond economic justice, we must also reshape how the world relates to Africa. We must demand that our governments and institutions treat African nations not as junior partners, charity cases, or resource mines, but as equals, as sovereign voices in the global conversation. That begins by ending exploitative contracts, rejecting foreign meddling, and amplifying the movements that call for genuine African self-reliance. President John F. Kennedy once asked the world to remember those in the huts and villages of half the globe struggling to break the bonds of mass misery. That struggle is not over. It is not history. It is the present. And we are all implicated. Like him, we must pledge our allegiance not to hollow independence, scripted and staged by colonial administrators, but to authentic liberation, the kind that Captain Traore and others are risking everything to achieve. By standing with an Africa Foundation rooted in equality, dignity, and memory, we do more than speak truth. We help dismantle the last shadows of empire. The horrors of colonialism did not vanish in 1960. They were written into budgets, treaties, and textbooks, but we have the power and the duty to expose those legacies and demand better, not only for Africa, but for the soul of our shared humanity. If this truth stirred something in you, don't let it fade in silence. Share this message. Let others know that Africa's story is not a tale of defeat, but of resistance, resilience, and rising power. The next chapter must be written by Africa, for Africa, in its own voice, on its own terms. Subscribe now for more unfiltered history, raw truths, and bold visions for change. Be part of a movement that stands with Africa, not as a silent observer, but as an active ally. Stand with truth. Stand with justice. Stand with the future.